Psychedelics are only worth studying in terms of their brain effects because their psychological effects are so damn stunning. I'm a scientist, I study drugs and I study psychedelic drugs. With psychedelics, what you're doing is you're providing this window of opportunity. This is the tool to modernize psychoanalysis. What would modern contemporary psychology and psychiatry look like if acknowledgement of the unconscious mind took kind of center stage again?
Taking an LSD trip at all, they're just being complete fools.
People thought in the 50s, this is principally what psychedelics do, is that they flatten the mind's landscape so you can see further. Psychedelics were going to be banned and there was no hearing any of the science anymore. There was an agenda, a decision had been made. Psychedelics got lumped in with heroin and hard and dangerous drugs. People started becoming obviously more interested in the research and can see the value and how it can help people. And so there was a decision to be made. Do we finally acknowledge this? And thankfully, they said, we're going to embrace it. And this happened around a time that I was trying to solidify my career and career direction. So to have that level of institutional support is pretty unprecedented. Psychedelics can be truly stunning, I think, in terms of their effects and the lessons and how it can help people. And I think in a roundabout way, whether the mainstream knows it or not, we're going to get there.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... A lot has happened in the 6.5 years since I first spoke with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. First of all, he's created the Psychedelic Research Center at Imperial College. It's the first one I've ever heard of at a major university in the entire world. This is big stuff. He's also completed studies on LSD, DMT, and Psilocybin to see how those psychedelic components affect the brain, what happens to us during those experiences. And he's got to be one of the most important figures in the world now doing groundbreaking research. And London Real is no stranger to psychedelics. I was drinking ayahuasca within the first 10 episodes. I did a DMT before and after, and I think these substances are the solution to so many problems we have as humans because it gives us new perspective on our lives and how we treat each other. And what Robin is doing and Dr. David Nutt is so important. It's important for you to understand this, to watch this episode. Robin really opens up about him, his research, and how these components can change who we are as human beings. So sit back, enjoy this episode. It's very important to our future. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, the psychologist, neuroscientist, and head of Psychedelic Research Center at Imperial College London. Yours is the world's first organization dedicated to the research of mind-altering substances and focuses on 3 key areas of study: mental health, social science, and neuroscience. You were the first in the world to investigate the effects of LSD using modern brain imaging and the first to study psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, for treating severe depression. You're also conducting groundbreaking neuroimaging research with MDMA and DMT. Robin, welcome back to London Real.
Thanks, Brian. Lovely to be here.
Great to have you back. It's been 6.5 years since we had you here. What's been going on since? You've been busy.
Yes, I have.
What has changed in your world? I mean, wow.
Gosh, yeah, a lot. It's difficult to know where to start. When I was last in, we hadn't kicked off our depression research. And so where we are right now with a very broad awareness, I think, of the potential of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, for treating depression, just almost feels like more or less kind of common knowledge, you know. You might imagine your auntie or something has heard of this, but back then it wasn't really on the radar. This is 2013, I think I was last in. And so we were writing a grant application to study magic mushroom therapy, psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression. Subsequently won that grant from the Medical Research Council in the UK and did that study. And it was the first one with psilocybin in obvious depression, a diagnosis of depression and really quite severe depression. Published in 2016. Takes a good while to turn your work into, first of all, analyze it and then turn it into a published paper. But that's where the news broke, and then we had similar-ish studies coming from Johns Hopkins, the team there in end-of-life distress, showing very clear signal with psilocybin for end-of-life distress, looking at depression outcomes, NYU at the same time. And so it was a kind of sort of double whammy in a way, or triple whammy, with those two studies coming in shortly after ours. And now we're in a situation where the FDA in the US have granted breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Wow. Psilocybin therapy, and the EMA people there are have been very supportive and positive, and a lot of money coming into the space for the required drug development, and then things going on outside of the typical regulatory route with things like the city of Denver decriminalizing magic mushroom use, Oakland following suit, an initiative in Oregon to fully legalize psilocybin therapy. So, a lot's happened.
That's a lot. And I went to the Royal Society when you presented your paper, I think, on LSD research. Was that right? Maybe in 2017?
Yeah. Gosh, that was a seminal moment.
That was a big moment, and everyone was there. The whole crew was there. Graham Hancock and Amanda Fielding and Rupert Sheldrake and Professor David Nutt and you, who had all been on the show. And that was a big moment, right?
It was. I remember just describing it as a dream come true, and that's how it's been, really. I remember probably around 2005 initially kind of having the vision, I suppose, to do an LSD brain imaging study, and then went knocking on Professor David Nutt's door, the former drug czar in the UK, and obviously still a very influential figure in drug policy and drug science, and asking him if I could do this research with LSD, this brain imaging research, and then getting to know Amanda Fielding. And it was all, I got my foot in the door, but it was a pipe dream.
Why did you have that dream? Because it was kind of your dream that made a lot of this happen. I know you've had great support, amazing fundraising from Fielding, and obviously Professor David Nutt has been very big, but you're kind of the young gun that's always had this kind of quest for this knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the fair thing is to say it's very much a shared dream, and in a sense, I found the right people at the right time. But to bring up dreams is relevant because I had been studying psychoanalysis when I got into the area, discovering Stanislav Grof's book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, and passages in there where he likened the LSD state to the dream state. And that was a light bulb moment for me. And, studying psychoanalysis and all the abstraction there and thinking, is there real substance here? Because it kind of feels intuitively like this unconscious mind exists that's vast and rich and influential in so many different ways. But how can you get a handle on it? How can you get better access? And then, so discovering that people thought in the 50s and 60s that this is principally what psychedelics do, is that they, kind of flatten the mind's landscape so you can see further and see deeper. I thought, well, this is the tool. I actually thought this is the tool to modernize psychoanalysis, because I was very much a I'd signed up to psychoanalysis, more or less. I critiqued it, but I was signed up.
So Jung and Freud and all that, you were...
Yeah, I was sold on it, really.
Okay.
So I thought, oh, this is the tool to kind of, take this thing that's been sort of sidelined from mainstream science, whether, through its own doing or through, it being kind of pushed out by the mainstream, or a bit of both, which is often the way things really are. It's happened, and what would modern contemporary psychology and psychiatry look like if psychoanalysis or depth psychology or the acknowledgement of the unconscious mind took kind of center stage again? Because it hadn't been for so long. We have this sort of mechanistic, cognitive neuroscience and psychology that's very depleted, really, as a account of the human soul, the human condition. Very, unsatisfactory to me when I found that in psychology, that it was dominated by this very shallow psychology. But what if that richness was to come back? It would really revolutionize psychology and psychiatry. And I think in a roundabout way, whether the mainstream knows it or not, we're going to get there.
The mainstream doesn't know it.
I don't think so, because there's still... It's a hard thing to shift, the whole kind of medical model and that desire. There's a lot of wish fulfillment in science, as there is in other domains. And you have explanations which can serve as explanations of convenience, like genetic explanations for things. Sometimes it can be easier to say, I don't know, my son or whatever has schizophrenia because of some genetic abnormalities, and nothing around environment or experience or even parenting had any role there, done genetics. But we now know with increasing confidence that there are crucial interactions, between biology and drug actions and context, environment and all aspects of context beyond just one's immediate environment. So it's a rich, complex problem that could never really, if you think about it, have been solved by just a drug or, I don't know, some genetic engineering or something. It needs you need to come at it from a couple of directions and then look for some kind of synergy where those things meet. And, that's what psychedelic therapy does.
And you're kind of on the edge. I mean, you're a scientist, and you're trying to quantify things. That's ultimately what you do. But the psychology side isn't always about quantification, right? And so you're kind of on this weird edge where you're trying to really prove the science behind this as opposed to the theories. And when it comes to psychedelics, you've got obviously all sorts of other, things wrapped up into it as far as human emotions and feelings and what we think it is, not to mention then the whole past of it being illegal and banned. So there's a lot going on with your field in that sense.
Yeah, it's true. It is a fine line to walk. But for me, a lot of it comes from, first of all, I suppose when you're immersed in it, and I've been reflecting on this recently. I've always reflected on it, really, whether I'm too immersed in my work. But just recently, a junior colleague, said something which made me very self-aware.
What was that? Can you share it?
Yeah, I can, yeah. So I was telling him about how I was recently invited to speak at the International Psychoanalysis Association event. And this was quite cool for me, given my background of interest, but I'd never really been formally training as an analyst or doing any academic work really in the psychoanalytic space. So it was a novelty. And there I was presenting on my brain imaging research and how it interfaces with psychoanalysis. And I was telling him I was in a talk, a session before my talk on psychoanalysis and politics. And the analysts in the room were discussing the role of an analyst as being neutral, that you don't take a position, and how that is clinically the way they do things, because then you project onto your analyst all these different things that tell you something about your unconscious, you know. And there are things like transference, you know, relationships that play out where the analyst may become a father figure or a mother figure, that kind of thing. So anyway, they were talking about neutrality, and they were sort of saying it's difficult when you see things going on politically to remain neutral, and that dilemma of whether you become partisan and sort of declare your views, or you remain neutral, just watching what's playing out in the world. And one of the analysts said, I decided I would take a position, and then another analyst colleague accused me of manic defense. And I thought, what a fascinating term. I'm sure I've heard it before, but I've never really digested the term, but manic defense. And so I was telling my colleague this over lunch, and he said, you know, very sort of gently, have you ever reflected on whether something like this happens with you, with your work? And I sort of smiled and said, yes. But I'd never really digested it, you know. So I looked at him and I said, it's remarkable how blind we can be to our defenses. And he sort of quietly nodded, and we got on with things. But since that was only a couple of days ago, I've been thinking about that a lot, you know.
And so how does that actually manifest itself in that the fact that you're blind to your own assumptions about your own work, thinking that it's this and it's that,
Yeah.
and the manic defense is something you just put up when someone tries to challenge that? Or am I misunderstanding?
I think it's just what psychological function does your work do for you?
Okay.
You know, it's that. And of course we can all relate to that, and we all get lost in our work. In a sense, it's the condition, but this is of course deferring it onto everyone, so normalizing it. It's the condition of particularly the modern Western man, you know, that you're always active.
Yeah.
And
so that can make you less objective because you're always...
perhaps less sort of fully sort of aware of yourself and sitting with everything like you would if you were meditating, for example, and things start coming up, or you're in a psychedelic session and things are coming up, some of which are difficult and painful to sit with, but you sit with them, you know, because that's the name of the game.
Yeah.
But in a sense, what work can do, and it's not always the case, but often it's the case, is it kind of takes us away from ourselves, and we almost forget and maybe repress by being so immersed in our work. So it was that really that got me. It was a bit of a reminder, because I've sort of always known that. But
yeah, and you are very immersed in your work.
Yeah.
And it is really important work, and you probably are constantly being reminded how important it is and being told how important it is. You know, the psychedelic experience is interesting, and like, I'd like to let everyone know, I mean, don't let this suit and tie fool you, but like London Real started off really based in the experience, you know, and I was a former banker, and I think within 5 or 10 episodes, I was going on my first ayahuasca experience, and I was talking about it on YouTube before and after. And I honestly thought the Bank of England would never allow me back in the financial markets. And there were people in the ayahuasca community, now it wasn't a big community because online wasn't that big then, but they were saying, don't do this, blah, blah, blah. And it was like a big deal at the time.
Yeah.
And it's funny, Robin, I also remember my daughter at school saying the word ayahuasca in 5th grade, and the nurse calling us and the headmistress calling us. It was like a private school, and you know, in Belsize Park, and bringing us in.
Yeah.
What is this all about?
Right. How did they know what ayahuasca was?
Yeah, they were really judging us,
Right,
and it was a really difficult situation. You know, why is she talking about this? And I guess she just heard it, or I don't know. And then I had to make a decision to do our episode on DMT, and I did a before and after DMT episode with Alexander Ward, who was a co-host last time we spoke. And this is before this became really popular on YouTube, where everyone was doing these before and afters. Ended up being our most watched episode of all time. You know, in comparison with some of the most famous people in the world, it was just me before and after my first DMT experience.
Oh,
and
wow.
so there was a real need for it out there.
Yeah.
And these were questions I was asking really early on. And, you know, how do you usually explain what you do to a stranger on the street? And what is the reaction when you mention psychedelics.
Yeah, well,
use words like magic mushrooms and things like that.
It's a funny question because if you're, let's say you're at a party or something, I'm often a bit reluctant to say because there are one of two responses still, but mostly actually it's more in the kind of emphatic interest and they want to know more and more. And you realize that you've come to this party to relax and you're sort of back at work. And I hate that. So I try to, to avoid it a little bit. But what I'll say is that I'm a scientist, and if I decide I'm going to actually tell them, I'll say I study drugs and I study psychedelic drugs, and I like to just put it out there like that. I don't want to say hallucinogens or psychoactive, because for me there's a kind of agenda in a way, which is that I really sort of believe in the term psychedelic. Intentionally, at some point in doing my research, I was noticing that people were still referring to these drugs as hallucinogenic, and I made a conscious decision that from here on I'm just going to call them psychedelics, because the term mind manifesting, mind revealing, making the mind visible, however you want to translate it, is at the crux of why these compounds are interesting and potentially very useful. So I put it out there, and usually they kind of know, or they've got some idea what that is, and then I'll say, oh, like LSD, magic mushrooms.
And you like the term magic mushrooms, even though last time I think I called you on it was like, I don't like using that term because it makes it sound like some kind of a goofy ride. And you were like, no, I like using that term because what? Why do you like using that term?
Mostly just because people then know what you're talking
right.
about.
It's the quickest way.
It's a little reminder that not everyone knows what psilocybin is.
Yeah.
Or how to say it, because I'm not sure I'm saying it right still, because the Americans call it psilocybin, and I've always been calling it psilocybin, and it's stuck. But you say magic mushrooms and everyone's on the same page, But I haven't really kind of thought too much about the problem for a scientist to be referring to these things as magic. They're kind of like the nickname, magic mushrooms, because psychologically the experience feels magical. There's no getting around that. I think Richard Dawkins has a book called something like The Magic of Nature. So it's that same kind of use of the term.
Right.
Yeah, magic.
And so then from psychedelics, do most people have strange reactions? Oh, that's that stuff that was banned, the illegal stuff, the stuff the hippies do.
Yeah.
That, or do they usually say, oh, I've heard about that stuff can be helpful for depression? That probably doesn't happen.
Well, no, it's that.
Really?
Yeah, it's much more that. Yeah.
These days?
Almost across the board.
Interesting.
For someone, I'm a little taken aback when actually they're the former, and they say, oh, that's dangerous, isn't it? Oh, it depends on the context, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
But these substances you're researching on had such a long history of being illegal, ostracized. And you kind of alluded earlier that some of that was maybe the responsibility of someone else and some of that was the responsibility of the people using it. What did you mean by that? And how do you tell that story of these compounds being illegal and, banned for so long?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those debated questions, who's to blame in a sense, or how did that happen, and lots of interesting different views on it. Do we all blame Timothy Leary, or is that scapegoating slightly? I've been told off by senior people in psychedelic medicine, very respected, for playing that game and sort of lazily saying it was all Leary's fault. And they said it so forcefully that it did make me think. I could see how he's been used as just a scapegoat for something else that was going on. When you dive into some of the material that's available about what was going on at that time in terms of the changes in the legislature, there was an agenda, a decision had been made that psychedelics were going to be banned, and there was no hearing, any of the science anymore. There's this classic dialogue with Bobby Kennedy in the Senate meeting where he's saying, I don't understand it. The evidence is there that these compounds used in the right professional way can be very helpful in some cases. Why isn't this evidence being heard anymore? And then it was the usual kind of, the barrier comes down and there's no conversation, they're just being banned,
And that was like an actual Senate hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that material, everyone can look that up.
This is in the 60s, right? Must have been.
Yeah, late 60s.
Right,
sort of 67, I think, things started to take a turn. And it wasn't that Nixon was in then, it was LBJ, I think. But it's still, these compounds, these became a problem. And quite why that was, I don't know. David Nutt thinks it might be Vietnam. It's quite easy to see how it could be if you feared that this was fueling a kind of anti-authoritarianism, a questioning rather than just a signing up for country. Yeah, I guess we'll never know what was said behind closed doors, but it happened anyway, and psychedelics got lumped in with heroin and truly hard and dangerous drugs. And then, the powers that be could interface with media in a particular way that it all became very believable that these are really dangerous drugs. And so people stopped questioning it.
Is there a bit of a parallel with kind of the reefer madness and the way that cannabis was kind of demonized, I guess like 30 years earlier?
Yeah.
And then with the media way it was back then, it was just kind of bought.
Yeah.
The public bought it.
Yeah, because the media was so much easier to control.
Yeah.
But now, it's information overload. But it's a different problem now, isn't it?
Now it's trying to find the truth, right?
Yeah.
So then basically all research on psychedelic substances was put on hold for about 30 years.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. From the late 60s, things began to stop in the US, and the main suppliers of the drugs, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, now Novartis, stopped making it. They could see that this was problematic for their company that was going places, and so they thought, we don't need this. And actually, people don't realize that those, who control the production, people have famously referred to this, but hold such a power card. And so with that stopping, I think people underappreciate the importance of Sandoz stopping making the LSD, because all of the LSD research in the States, which was the lion's share really, was being done with Sandoz LSD, and then Indocin, which was the brand name for Psilocybin.
Okay, and that was just a European company, and then they stopped making it, so then there was just nothing to be able to study.
Yeah, Swiss company, and then
Right.
Some people in then the Czechoslovakia were making it, and so Stan Grof was doing some work there, a Czech psychiatrist. But that was small fry relative to the way things were beforehand.
Okay, now that was for 30 years, then nothing kind of happened, and then there was just more of an open-minded thing happening here, and then obviously you got interested around 2005, and people started to just say, wait a second, there's all this anecdotal evidence of people doing these things on their own. We need to look into this more.
Yeah, but also there's all this scientific evidence. Because the work was published in the 50s and 60s and has since been meta-analyzed, as we say, reviewed and then published in reviews that show, even though the quality of the research wasn't up to today's standards, for the period, it wasn't so bad, and there was a lot of it. And so we can glean some information from looking at this work, and we can look at things like safety. And when you go into that science, you discover, as I did, when I was looking to do the brain imaging work, that it looks very compelling when you lay it out. Of course, you're looking for side effects and tolerability and risks. And in the published work, you're not really seeing it. You're instead seeing meta-analyses that are saying suicide is incredibly rare in controlled research. People going mad, incredibly rare. You just don't really see it.
Which is what they used to say. You're going to jump out of a window and you're going to do all these things, right?
Yeah.
but the research shown that actually that wasn't
That's
the
right.
case.
So it's just, the way you create these, the media creates these illusions that then become believed as if they're fact. Yeah.
And what is actually going on in the brain? I actually, funny enough, I have such a strange job, because about 2 weeks ago, I was sitting down with a guy named Dan Bilzerian, who's got about 44 million followers on social media. He's known for kind of having a Playboy mansion in LA and about 20 or 30 women surrounding him at all times. And he's going into the cannabis and the CBD market with his company Ignite. And he's a fan of psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms. And he goes on the beach and he takes them. And even though he's probably very wealthy, he said, Brian, some of the greatest times I've ever had is just on the beach with mushrooms. And he said, I realized I'm having an experience that any hippie could have. And it's just kind of nice to know that it doesn't need money for me to have this kind of an interesting experience. And I said, how much are you taking? And I encouraged him to take a heroic dose, like Terence McKenna would say. I've never actually taken 5 grams, but I've taken 4. And, I was encouraging him, and he said, no, that's a little too much. I like to be in control. I'm a control freak. And I was just like, well, it might be painful, but it also can be very revealing. And so it was interesting that he said that to me, and I was just thinking about you now, and I was wanting to know what is actually going on in your brain for people like him to seek this experience out for clarity. I know for me, I went last year and had 3 powerful ayahuasca ceremonies in Costa Rica, and the second one was, honestly, Robin, the single most profound experience of my entire life.
Yeah.
Of my entire life.
Yeah.
And I try to do a lot of work on myself. I do a lot of learning, but I don't know how I would have ever gotten that experience or seen or learned the things about myself that I did.
Yeah. Psychedelics can be truly stunning, I think, in terms of their effects and the way it just to say they're surprised doesn't come close. It's just stunned. I just didn't know that was possible. And also the precision, the apparent precision with which psychedelics can reveal psychologically salient information that before might have been sort of known through the corner of your eye or whatever, but then it's just laid out, and that feels so. I want to avoid the word profound because it's easy to overuse, but profound.
For example, when it might show you something about a relationship or about how you're treating your body or something that is just, wow, it's like you said, so salient. And yet you kind of probably knew it in the back of your mind, but you never paid attention.
It's very easy to create a decoy or distract yourself from that information.
Which is what most of us do in the modern world. We constantly distract ourselves, don't we?
Yes.
And with mobile technology and the internet, it's 10 times easier than it was when I grew up as a kid. There wasn't a lot to do. It was like go out in the backyard and play. But now there's so many more distractions.
Of course.
Maybe more of a need to take a break and allow that mind to do things.
Yes, yeah. No, I think so. And then, so the psychology is there, and really it's the psychology that draws people in. As a colleague of mine said, who's very much a kind of mechanistic, computational neuroscientist, he said that the brain is only as interesting as the mind. And of course it is. Like, psychedelics are only worth studying in terms of their brain effects because their psychological effects are so damn stunning, that you just think, what else would you want to do with your time than open that black box, that big wonder of what the hell is going on there, in terms of what went on in my brain during that experience. And the psychological experience can be so stunning that it's so easy to think it was beyond the brain. And it's what so many people do. I would say it's probably the typical thing that people do. More often than not, they'll think, well, that's evidence that the mind's beyond the brain, of course, because it's, surely impossible that the brain could account for something like that. I became oneness, I saw entities that are as real as me looking at you now. So it's incredibly compelling. So then, if you subscribe to the value of the brain, which I do, obviously, you kind of rub your hands together because you think, well, all the more kind of interest and reason to crack this problem, because it's creating an illusion otherwise. And so, yeah.
And so I'm not talking to aliens, and I'm not talking to entities, or you would like to approach it as a scientist and say, what's actually going on in the brain, as opposed to the non-scientific human explanation, which is, I'm talking to other entities, I'm connecting with some power outside in the universe. Yeah. And you're here to challenge that and say, let's actually look at what's happening in the brain.
Well,
and that can make you unpopular.
Yeah, it can. And someone once said to me that, oh, you wanna piss on our fire? And I said, no, I don't. Because I'm a psychologist, probably at core. So the phenomenology is bottom line, and it's what draws me into the brain. So I don't want to piss on any fires. I'd like those fires to rage, because it is fascinating. But I'm not going to subscribe to a view that it was beyond brain. I mean, the psychology is the psychology is the psychology. It's the experience is the experience is the experience. It is what it is. So let's look at that, and let's look at how people's whole, metaphysical beliefs can change fundamentally after a psychedelic experience, and just treat that as a scientific phenomenon of interest and a psychological phenomenon of interest. What is the mechanisms underlying that and the psychology of such profound belief shifts?
Right.
But I still want to know what's going on in the brain, because the brain's a thing of nature, like the experiences are a thing of nature.
Right. So you still are with the other people as saying the result and the psychology of how your mind changes is really important. But you're just saying, look, I got these fMRI images that literally show me what's happening in the brain. There's no entity coming in. There's none of this stuff. So let's just study that part. And but I'm not taking away from all the other wonderful things that happen, and the knowledge and the knowing yourself.
Yeah. So I'm saying it's worth knowing, and by knowing it, does it kill the possibility that, I don't know, you literally transcended these dimensions and went to another world, the spirit world, the entity world? I would say it's not really understanding the neural correlates of the experience that challenges the reality, if you want, or the literalness of having transcended these dimensions and gone to another world. I would instead say, where is there something beyond appealing to weird physics, as people often do, and say, oh, well, quantum physics is really weird, so, let me put some bridges, some inferential leaps between these holes and create some elaborate story for how quantum physics can account for leaping into the DMT world.
Is this bro science thrown into, and you don't appreciate
So basically, there's just nothing compelling about the literal transition into another space. Even forget about brain, it's just, I can only accept the null, as you would say in science, the null hypothesis, which is there's an absence of evidence. So therefore I have to sit with the null, that you didn't actually literally transcend these dimensions. I could also say you could treat the brain stuff as maybe endorsing that view, but it's really not the heavy weight on that view. The heavy weight is the fact that there's no evidence for it, other than the experience. But that can be a logical fallacy, like the flat earthers that most likely started because when you look out at the earth from the vantage of just standing there and not knowing, any more than that, it feels like the earth's flat, that it's probably just going to keep going on. If you walk, you just keep going on, so the earth is flat. Or you look out at the stars and you think, well, I'm here, maybe this is the center of the universe. And then you discover, when you've got better techniques for looking beyond, that in fact it's not. So it's a similar...
So assuming there's a spirit world is kind of the same thinking of a flat earther?
It's a bit of a... It took me a while because I'm not a philosopher and I'm not formally read in that space, but through realizing that I had to get, some basic knowledge, I discovered that I think that view is solipsism, that based on your experience, that's your test of what's real. But then the flat earther uses their experience as their test of what's real, and the person who thinks that they're the center of the universe, again, or that we're special and not in any way related to animals. You know, it's this kind of intuitive experience that is your test of reality. But what I would say is that if you look a bit harder and do a bit of research, you discover that those views aren't so reliable and robust.
And so what is going on in the brain?
Yeah. So first of all, you know, you're taking a drug, and that, again, that's one clue perhaps as to the fact that this organ is important. It gets into the body. It needs to get into the brain. And for simplicity, let's just say it gets into the brain. And then what's happening? Well, these chemicals, the molecules themselves, look a lot like serotonin. Most people have heard of serotonin. Actually, most of the body's serotonin's outside of the brain. But again, for simplicity, let's look in the brain. Within the brain, it does some really important things. It modulates how we feel. Actually, when people typically think of serotonin, they usually think of that. They think it's some kind of happy hormone. And very broadly speaking, sure, you know, there's something in that. When you increase serotonin levels in a major turbocharged way, like you do with MDMA, you feel great typically. And then you have a crash afterwards and the serotonin drops and you feel rough.
Yeah,
you know?
That's no good. That's why I stopped doing it.
Yeah, or the less turbocharged way, you take some SSRIs, some Prozac-like drugs, and they'll increase the availability of serotonin. And then all of a sudden, stress is a bit more tolerable and life's a little bit more tolerable and you're getting by a bit better. That's pretty much what SSRIs do.
Okay.
So psychedelics working on serotonin, but they're working on the serotonin system in a particular way. They're mimicking serotonin. They're kind of serotonin imposters. They hijack a particular aspect of the serotonin system and they stimulate it. And the important thing to say is that serotonin is a really complex neuromodulatory system. Neuromodulators, these chemicals like serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, that tune the way the brain works. It's not simple fuel or simple like glutamate would be in the brain, another important brain chemical, or GABA, another chemical that has an inhibitory role. It's like the brake or the fire blanket that puts things out. These are the fine tuners, and serotonin is a particularly complex fine tuning system. It has these 14 different receptors that serotonin binds to, that each do quite different things. Some are related, but often they're doing really quite different things, and actually, in some cases, opposite things to each other, kind of counteracting each other, as often happens in nature. You know, think of things like CBD and THC in the cannabis that kind of counteract each other a bit. So there's one particular receptor that seems really important for how psychedelics work, because if you block it with a drug that selectively blocks that receptor, people don't trip. They don't have their experiences. So that's pretty compelling evidence. There's other stuff like the affinity of a psychedelic for that receptor correlates with its potency very strongly. So LSD, very high affinity, very potent. Mescaline, not so high affinity, doesn't bind so strongly. You need loads more of it to get a psychedelic trip. Now, we also know from a certain brain imaging technique that the proportion of these 2A receptors, serotonin 2A receptors, these are the really important ones, that are bound to by a psychedelic predicts the intensity of a trip as well. And this is really useful new information, which is telling us what dose is needed to have a psychoactive effect, which is interesting in the context of microdosing, for example.
Right.
Taking very low doses. But it's also saying that there may be a certain kind of kink or inflection point where when you go over a particular dose, it becomes a different kind of experience altogether. The kind of thing that people have intuited all along, but now we've got brain evidence that's saying it's because of a certain proportion of these receptors being occupied by the drug and stimulated leading to the ego dissolution, mystical type experiences that people have.
Is there an example of that in like psilocybin when you go from like a, I don't know, like half a gram to like the 5 grams?
Yeah.
Where
So the inflection point seems to be around 20 milligrams and about 60%, I think, occupancy of these receptors. That's when it takes a leap up. It starts leaping up. And lo and behold, those are the doses that we're choosing to give in the therapeutic work, where we're intending for people to have these very profound, transformative experiences. So there,
is that like would you call those like an ego dissolution experience, or is that a term you don't like to use?
No, I like that one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'd slightly question mystical experience. Mystical type is a bit better. Peak experience is overtly a humanistic term, so it's better in my view than appealing to mystery, which is kind of saying that there's, something beyond, which is I can't sign up to because there's no evidence for that.
Right.
Beyond.
Right. So there's nothing beyond because there's no evidence of that. And also, you as a scientist, you kind of have to stay in that lane anyways, right? In order to do your work.
Otherwise, you're not being rational. I mean, if there's no evidence,
yeah.
What else are you basing your assumptions on? That it feels a particular way? I just don't think that's good enough, strong enough evidence, because it's so easy to be fooled by so many things that feel very compelling, but you look a little harder, and things appear differently.
Okay, so just back to the science, you kind of understanding the receptors and then the dosages, and if you get to this certain kind of critical mass, then you have these kind of more profound experiences where that's where you're focusing on to see if you can get these results when it comes to studying depression and anxiety and PTSD and some of these other things.
Yeah.
And I remember once you talked about kind of an orchestra and the conductor, and I've heard this analogy, it's like removing the conductor from the orchestra, and so the instruments are kind of playing on their own. Is that still an analogy you like to use?
Yeah, it's a good one. In fact, that analogy was taken to a more literal point where some colleagues of mine ran a study where they recorded brain activity when people were making music. And they got classically trained musicians to play to script some classical music, and then to enter a phase where they could improvise, and it became a kind of jazz classical music crossover. And they recorded their brain activity, and they found that when they went into that improvisation mode, the activity became richer, less predictable, more entropic. And so that analogy wasn't just so much for analogy anymore, it was more a kind of curious sort of crossover into what was actually going on in a particular brain state where people recorded brain activity and people were kind of freewheeling in a way that your mind does kind of naturally under a psychedelic.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.